where. But all of this in the name really of these new strategic and effectiveness agendas. Just to, I mean, many of you know this already, but I'm just going to highlight here is the new countries of concentration list. And the one thing that's very, very evident from this list is the removal of many, many African countries that had formerly been countries of concentration for a bilateral program, and acceleration of Latin American countries, including the Caribbean region, as focus for cooperation. New thematic foci building up over the last year, but in some sense only recently announced, on food security, child protection, at least as framed by the minister recently, child protection mainly concentrating on health of children, not on educational levels, sustainable economic growth. Additional thematic directives, a new attention to skills for employment. So after many years of withdrawing from technical and vocational skills training, CIDA has announced new initiatives. One of the things you always have to ask yourself is when CIDA gets into a new initiative, how's it going to deliver that initiative? And does it tie the aid back to Canadian sources or Canadian services? And in this case, of course it does. It's a program that is going to be entirely operationalized through the ACCC, the community colleges of Canada. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but something just to think of as a potential for retying aid to the delivery of Canadian services. Other thematic directions. Security sector reform, a huge topic inside the agency now, one that I can't remember being discussed at all in the 1990s. So a new direction, not part of the overall formalized policy framework, but something that's being talked about. And if you look at where the money is flowing, you'll find this is a very big section of what's being spent. And then efforts to enhance governance and democracy support. There's a wonderful volume on the last decade of Canada's efforts to work on governance overall that shows that we did many, many things and none of them were connected, nothing linked up. And now there's a new effort inside CIDA to create a renewed unit that will do governance but integrate it with human rights and child protection. And perhaps reflecting a failure of policy coherence, too early to say, at the same time an opening of a new democracy agency outside the agency, which I assume will program ODA in some way on governance issues. I had the chance recently to look at CIDA spending data for the most recent year. That data is available for 2007, 2008. I think that the geographic allocations are shifting. It's hard to say from that year, but I think one more year we'll know what the real trend is. But certainly overall spending to Asia has now topped that for Africa for the first time in 5 or 6 years, and by a fairly substantial amount. Africa branch saw its first dip in funding in 2007 and 2008. Since Canada had made the commitment early in the decade to double its aid to Africa. Education spending in Africa so far has been very well protected, but the reason, the way that protection is happening is that overall aid is stabilizing or coming down, and aid to education is actually going up. So in Africa, education aid is 21% of total bilateral spending. In Asia, education is coming up as well as a percentage of the total, but the total is also itself coming up. More than double spent on education since 2005. A lot of this growth comes from really one investment, and that's our investment in, I usually try not to slip into the language of investment actually, but what CIDA would describe as it's our investment in Afghanistan, which has really driven this shift in geographic allocations. I recently finished a paper on the way that Canadian aid is programmed in conflict, for education in conflict-affected states. And I think the clear message here is that We're doing a lot more in conflict-affected states than we have ever done in the past. But the number of conflict-affected states we're doing it in is a very small subset, and primarily, not uniformly, but primarily, the big winners of this have been those linked to security issues like Pakistan and Afghanistan. The very few of the bilateral programs that operate in conflict-affected states actually address in any deep way the issue of the content of education, that is, what kind of peace-building capacity do schools have both in their organization and in their curriculum. So it's, to me, a question and opportunity. The Humanitarian Assistance Directorate at CIDA, through my interviews with them, expressed, well, yeah, of course, education's for child protection, but it's not something we take a stand on. It's up to our the people the channels we go through to fund responsibly, the appeals process, the responsive funding that happens. They have to tell us education is important. So I think really there's a lack of a central advocating direction from humanitarian aid to include education as part of its framing of child protection. And very, I mean, to me, wonderfully diverse programming at the country level that really, I think, could yield for CIDA many opportunities to learn and to compare and to grow an approach to education in conflict-affected states that's much richer than what is happening in any of its single country programs. The issue that I think taxes many of the members of the Canadian Global Campaign for Education is what's happening to Canadian funding for partnership. Over the history of Canadian aid, this has long been one of the hallmarks of our aid program, that we don't just fund through a bilateral program in which country desk officers put out a call to NGOs to fill a need as contractors, but we actually have a responsive pool of money. We allow civil society actors to come to the table with their ideas about what they want to do, and we fund it based on what they want to do. I think there are some considerable signs that this may be under threat, and it's an opportunity or an issue that needs some attention from our membership. First of all, and in a move that I must say I would congratulate, but I still think poses a threat for many of our membership organizations, Partnership Branch has been reorganized, and a new sectoral focus inside Partnership Branch. Now, the great thing about this is, for the first time perhaps, CIDA's funding may actually provoke among us a little more synergy, because at the moment many of us work on education, but we don't really talk much to one another, and perhaps the synergies across our programs are not very great. This may provoke that, but on the other hand, it seems to imply that this is no longer a responsive program. In other words, the government has set the priorities about what needs to be done, and the NGO sector now should respond by showing to the government that what they're proposing fits within these priority areas. So it raises some questions. Total partnership disbursements are down by about 10% from their 2001 high. And I cannot quite explain this to you, except to say that for whatever reasons, what is being spent in partnership on education has fallen year over year, from 19% at the beginning of the decade to about 14% in 2007 and 2008. And the other thing that's really interesting is that CIDA is now directly funding Southern CSOs through its bilateral programs. And I think this may be really a great thing, but it means that the NGOs, the Canadian-based CSOs, need to rethink what they're doing, because in the past we've always said, well, we'll be the conduit